UK politics turned upside down. Conservatives and Liberal Democrats unite in coalition. A marriage of convenience or a dangerous compromise? Can this coalition last? And what implications does it have for British government policy? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. Britain has its first coalition government in 70 years, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats in an unlikely alliance, and this follows last week's elections resulting in that hung parliament with no clear winner. Days of negotiations followed, of course, between Britain's three major parties. The Labour leader and Prime Minister Gordon Brown then submitted his resignation. And this cleared the path for a Conservative-led coalition government, David Cameron becoming Britain's new Prime Minister, Lib Dem party leader Nick Clegg his deputy. Well, joining us to discuss all this today are our guests, all in London. Ian Dale, a political commentator and columnist, Mehdi Hasan, the New Statesman's senior political editor, and Robin Shepherd, Director of International Affairs at the Henry Jackson Society in London too, as I say. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme, all of you. Mehdi, if I could start with you. Sense of partnership in the air and common purpose for the time being at least. How long do you reckon this honeymoon will last?
It's a very good question, and I think it's a question on everyone's lips. I suspect we may end up with another election within a year or two. I can't see it lasting that long unless they can somehow lock themselves into this fixed-term parliament that we're now told we're going to get. I think there's far too much difference between the two parties on huge issues like Europe, for example. But in the short run, I think they'll do fine. There's a lot of impetus behind them. The media are behind them. The public are probably behind them because everyone seems to want stable government now. Why wouldn't they? So I think Clegg and Cameron started off quite well yesterday. We saw them almost romantic in the Downing Street garden, having a love-in. So I think short term, they'll do all right. Long term, will they survive a whole parliament? I have my doubts.
Ian Dale, what do you reckon? Another election in a year or two?
It's always funny listening to left-wing commentators at the moment because they can't quite get their heads around the fact that the Conservatives are actually in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. There's actually far more in common in their policy platforms than a lot of people make out, and I think they both went into these coalition negotiations with their eyes wide open, and I think that there is a good chance that the coalition agreement will stick. Whether it'll be for the whole 5 years is doubtful, because if you look at the history of coalitions in Europe in particular, normally the coalition breaks up about a year before the election, so the parties have time to re-establish their own identities. But I would expect it to last the bulk of the parliament.
Mehdi, I don't suppose it is that easy for you, the likes of you to get your head around what's happened, is it?
Well, to be fair, it's not just difficult for me, it's difficult for quite a lot of Liberal Democrats. If you go online, Ian's a political blogger, he'll know very well, there are countless Liberal Democrat activist bloggers who are claiming that they're going to resign their membership of the party. 50% of Lib Dem voters identify themselves as... Well, wait a minute, 50% of Lib Dem voters told their pollsters that they see themselves as centre-left. Well, the Liberal Democrat Party is a centre-left party, so of course people like me are going to be surprised to see them in bed with a centre-right party like the Conservatives.
There are many people in the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, David Laws being two of them, who have a huge amount in common with the Conservatives, both in social outlook and indeed in economic outlook. Well, I mean, there are going to be Liberal Democrats and indeed Conservatives who will be unhappy with this coalition. Of course, there'll be some people ripping up their party membership cards. But my information is that both parties have experienced a huge boost in membership over the last 48 hours, as indeed I think the Labour Party has too, to be fair. I think the Liberal Democrats had a decision to make. They either remained a pressure group on the fringes of British politics, or they decided to be a political party and take power and try to implement their manifesto. Now, they've actually negotiated a brilliant deal with the Conservatives, and I pay tribute to their negotiating team. They've got far more out of this coalition arrangement than anyone ever thought they could.
Okay, Robin Shepherd. Well, I'm glad to hear there's an agreement on something. Robin Shepherd, how is this, would you say, perceived overseas? Is it a final British mess, or is it something that people may look at and say, well, they managed to sort it out and now they're getting on with it?
Well, I mean, the concept of coalition governments, certainly in Europe, is something which is completely normal. I mean, most countries have, in fact, all countries in the European Union have some form of proportional representation system or another, and that almost inevitably throws up coalition governments. So from their point of view, I think they're almost surprised that there's any great big fuss. The notion that there are only two parties in government is actually a sign in many countries of stability. I spend a lot of my time in Central Eastern Europe, whose countries which had to rebuild, had to completely build from scratch their democracies in the 1990s, and they chose largely the German system, which is where you have a 5% threshold to get into parliament. And what that very often results in is 3, 4, or sometimes 5 parties in a coalition. So from the perspective of our European neighbours, the only source of amazement is that anybody in Britain thinks there's anything really strange about what's going on.
Ian Dale, do you reckon politics in the UK is never going to be the same again? Is this the changing moment, if you like?
Well, it's not going to be the same again for the next couple of years, at least. What happens after that is anyone's guess. But what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 days, in some ways, has been very positive and shown politics in a good light. But there have been very negative things as well. I think if we had proportional representation as a voting system in this country, we would have this after every single election. And I'm not sure that I think that's necessarily a good idea. Every party goes into an election wanting to win a majority of seats. But I think what happened after this election was that Realpolitik came into the equation. The Labour Party tried to persuade the Liberal Democrats to go into coalition with them, but they didn't actually try very hard, and actually in the end seemed very lukewarm about it. And it would have been a little odd for the two parties that lost the election to go into coalition together in a sort of coalition of the losers.
OK, Mehdi, I get the sense that you're just bursting to come in.
It's just, well, I was actually agreeing with Ian there up to a point on the fact that actually all the political leaders have behaved very well, and we've shown that we can actually pull off coalition politics. I'm a supporter of coalition governments. I'm a supporter of proportional representation. It's sad that the Liberal Democrats actually sacrificed their commitment to proportional representation in order to get a few jobs in government. They didn't get PR from the Conservatives, despite their brilliant negotiating.
And they wouldn't have got it from Labour either.
Well, that's not necessarily true. Where I think Ian's having a laugh is this idea that it would have been a coalition of losers. Ian, the Conservative Party also lost this election. David Cameron failed to get a majority despite leading in the polls for 3 years against the most unpopular Prime Minister in our lifetimes. Nobody won this election. That's the definition of a hung parliament.
Mehdi, look at the arithmetic of this. David Cameron put on 100 seats. The Labour Party lost 99 seats. The Conservatives got 36%. Labour went down from 35 to 29%. You cannot possibly. Well, we have to operate under the electoral system that we have. You may want PR.
We don't. Some of us want to change the system. And the Liberal Democrats have sold out.
And the Labour Party could not bring in PR because about a third of Labour MPs, as you well know, do not support it. So it wouldn't have got through the House of Commons.
All right, gents, I'm going to stop this little debate just right now. I want to move it on a bit. Britain's political parties fight, of course, on ideological grounds, of course, on matters of policy. A coalition between the two parties has to mean a compromise on their respective positions, as we've been hearing. Here are some of the policies outlined in the coalition agreements. Let's have a look at economy first. They've agreed to cut the budget deficit by $8.8 billion as desired by the Conservatives. Meanwhile, they'll work towards Lib Dem plans to protect low incomes. On electoral reform, that's a big issue. After the recent elections, the two parties have agreed on holding a referendum. The Lib Dems pushing for proportional representation. On immigration, the Lib Dems were forced to accept the Conservatives' plan for a limit on non-EU economic migrants. On Britain's role in Europe, they've reached a truce. You could say they've agreed Britain will be a positive participant in the European Union, but neither, of course, will support joining the euro or transferring further powers to the EU. Robin Shepherd, the common good in the face of financial crisis gave all of this, I guess, a sense of urgency, didn't it? Had there not been that crisis, do you think this coalition would have happened?
It's a very interesting question. Obviously, it's purely speculative. I mean, I think to go back to some of the comments made by the other two guests, and coming back, in fact, to your first question about the longevity of the government, I think that even though the Liberal Democrats, who are in a way the weak link in this coalition, because many of their voters and certainly the majority of their activists have grave misgivings about it, but there is one thing that they want, and that is electoral reform. And even if it's not exactly what they want. There are probably things that we don't know yet about the House of Lords. People may be surprised to learn overseas that the upper house of the British Parliament is unelected, amazingly enough. And I suspect there will be moves which will come out as surprises where the Conservatives have given ground on that. But more generally, I think that, you know, the fact of the economic crisis, and let's remember last week the European Commission estimated that Britain's budget deficit as a proportion of GDP would reach 12%. That's the largest in the whole of the 27-member European Union. And I think that there is a public demand which the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives both feel they can answer, and in so doing bind themselves together to really put aside the traditional partisanship and really get to grips with an economic crisis which the like of which we certainly haven't seen in this country since before the Second World War.
Yeah, Mehdi Hasan certainly gives to be. Okay, Indel, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I think that's why it had to be a full coalition. I think if we had been in normal economic circumstances, David Cameron would have probably tried to have governed with a minority government. So it had to be a coalition. And I think the Conservatives have been quite canny in locking the Liberal Democrats into key economic positions. David Laws will be the new Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He's responsible for public spending cuts. You've got Vince Cable in charge of the business department. They've got to be locked in, and they've got to buy into the key economic decisions that are going to be taken by the Chancellor George Osborne in consultation with others, because there are going to be some very, very, very difficult decisions to be made, including probably putting up value-added tax.
Absolutely. As I say, it gives the two parties a real sense of purpose, doesn't it, Mehdi? And the first real test of this new government, and they can't really countenance failure, can they?
No, they can't count on failure, and it's interesting. I agree again with what Ian just said about locking the Tories being very canny. The Liberal Democrats have now exposed themselves to the fact that at the next election, the economic record of this government, and if we go back into recession, will be as much on their hands as on the Tory hands. And David Laws, who is a Liberal Democrat, will be the man, will be one of the two men whose faces will be on that budget that we see within 50 days, the emergency budget, which is going to cut spending. Here's my problem with the Liberal Democrat deal. The Liberal Democrats spent the entire election campaign agreeing with Labour that we shouldn't have spending cuts this year because the recovery was too fragile. We now have the leading Liberal Democrat economic voices, Vince Cable and David Laws, agreeing with the Conservatives that we should cut spending by up to £6 billion in this financial year, which is both absurd and slightly disingenuous.
Indale,
no,
true enough,
isn't
it?
It's not absurd, because the Labour Party has tried to threaten the British people with this ogre of £6 billion worth of cuts. What the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats are talking about is getting £6 billion worth of waste out of the economy. Remember, £6 billion is 1%
do you deny, Ian,
of public
that the Lib
spending.
Dems opposed that, the whole election campaign? Ian, are you going to deny that the Lib Dems opposed that and Vince Cable attacked George Osborne?
Well, they did, but in coalitions you have to make compromises.
So U-turn on their part.
You just said you're in favour. Hang on, you just said you were in favour of coalitions. You would have had to make compromises if you were in a negotiating position yourself.
Not on the biggest economic decision of all. You can compromise on immigration caps, not on the economy, not on whether we go back into recession.
Sorry, cutting public spending by 1%. Every business in this country has to cut public spending. Every business in this country has to cut public spending by 1%.
I need to split you two up because we'd like to. There are three. We do have three guests on this show. We would like to hear from Robin Shepherd. So, Robin, what's your view about your perspective about what these two guys are arguing about?
Well, I mean, I think that with great respect to both of them, and I think that, you know, one aspect that I think needs to be introduced into our thinking here is that a lot of this debate is a little bit like the debate that happened before the election. I mean, all three of Britain's political parties were condemned by think tanks and economists for not being completely open about how they would close this enormous deficit. I personally think that whatever constellation of political forces had come together to form a government, whether it be the Labour Party or the Liberal Dems or the Labour Party with the Lib Dems, whichever the way the votes had gone, we would have been facing public spending cuts. But one of the points about raising VAT, which will almost certainly come in from 17.5% to 20%, is that you can raise over £12 billion with such a move, and that can go quite a long way to bringing down the deficit to within, not to within manageable proportions in 1 year, of course, but combined with other cuts, combined with trying to cut out some of the waste, combined with things like public sector pay freezes, which I'm pretty sure are things that are going to be on the table very soon. you've got to build a proper strategy over a period of years to convince foreign investors, to convince the city, to provide businesses in this country with the confidence in the long term. And I suspect, as I say, I think you really can, to a great extent, remove a lot of the kind of heat out of the discussion by simply recognising the sheer scale of the problem we face, and therefore then accepting that whichever government had come to power, they would have to make a combination of cuts on the one hand and tax rises on the other.
OK, let's move it on now to a new arena, the arena of foreign policy. You know, the question is this an area where fractures may appear? Although the United Kingdom remains important to the United States, both leaders, Cameron and Clegg, have agreed on the need to review the UK's approach to the United States, or to United States relations, to make it, as was quoted, solid, not slavish. And the new government may look to strengthening ties with new emerging giants like India and moving closer to old friends like the Gulf countries. And then there's the thorny issue of Afghanistan and the ever-present question, of course, of peace in the Middle East. Ian Dale, what impact directly on foreign policy issues will this change of government bring, in your view? Anything very different?
I think that there are three areas, Europe being one, where David Cameron made clear right from the start that that was a red line in the negotiations, and the Liberal Democrats had to commit to not wanting to join the euro within the lifetime of this Parliament. I don't think they were ever seriously going to propose that anyway, it has to be said. I think on Afghanistan there is a potential for differences there, because the Liberal Democrats before the election were tiptoeing towards a position where I thought they might well advocate a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, they didn't get to that position, but that's certainly where they were heading. So I think it'll be interesting to see the junior ministerial appointments in the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Office, to see who they put in as the Liberal Democrat representative in those two departments. There was speculation yesterday that Paddy Ashdown, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats and the sort of Grand Commissar of Bosnia at one point, there was speculation that he might be the Defence Secretary. Now, that would have been an interesting move, but it didn't come about. Liam Fox, who's seen as quite a right-wing neocon, is the Defence Secretary. So it'll be interesting to see who they put in alongside him.
What about the Middle East crisis, Robin Shepherd? Interested to hear what your perspective is about that, because obviously a very important issue. Will there be any change in tone?
Well, as I wrote in an article for the Jerusalem Post on this yesterday, I think that given the scale of the economic crisis, and given the fact that the government's attention is going to be very heavily focused on that, what we're likely to see is that the foreign policy establishment in Great Britain, the Foreign Office, largely gets free rein to continue the kind of policies in the Middle East that it's had over several decades, in fact. I mean, if we're talking about the Middle East in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Foreign Office has traditionally supported a two-state solution. It tended to support the Arab and Palestinian side over the Israeli side, although of course they dispute that, but I think that is the general tenor. And I don't see any great new dynamics being introduced from the current administration that we've just had established in Great Britain to change that. I mean, William Hague, for one thing, doesn't seem to know very much about the Middle East, and he's the new Foreign Secretary.
OK, Mehdi Hasan?
That's not true at all.
I would just say the Liberal Democrats' foreign policy proposals are the proposals I liked of theirs the most. So, on one sense, I am glad that they're in this government, which does have neocons, as Ian Dale put it, in Liam Fox. Some would argue Michael Gove, George Osborne, and William Hague to a lesser extent, who are quite hawkish on foreign policy. I think the Liberal Democrats have been very strong in their opposition to the siege of Gaza. They've been very strong on Afghanistan. But to be fair, David Cameron as well has said he wants to bring troops home in this Parliament. And of course, on Iran, the Liberal Democrats were the only political party who explicitly ruled out military action against Iran in this Parliament. And Iran could be one of those thorny issues that we haven't talked about on the British domestic scene, which, like Iraq, dominated the last couple of parliaments. It could dominate this Parliament. So I think that's actually an interesting place for Nick Clegg and his party to find themselves. Perhaps there'll be a restraining influence on a very Atlanticist Tory administration.
It's always a big portfolio, isn't it, the Foreign Secretary's one, but it's particularly bulging at the moment, isn't it, with all sorts of potential crises, Ian Dale?
Well, I think it is. I want to disagree with Robin, who seems to think that William Hague knows nothing about foreign policy. Nothing could be further from the truth.
No, I'm not saying that. Well, I'm just saying that he doesn't seem to show... No, my point was, sorry, my point was simply that I don't think he's, the question was asked about the Middle East, and I don't think the Middle East is what he's really known to be an expert on. He's very much somebody who's focused heavily on the European Union, and my perception, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but my perception is that William Hague's views on the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example, are very much the kind of default position of the British foreign policy establishment.
Ian Dale, what do you say to that?
Therefore, much of a difference.
No, I think you're absolutely wrong. I think William Hague is much more pro-Israel than his predecessor David Miliband has been. I think you will find probably a difference between William Hague and the Foreign Office approach. It'll be interesting to see which one carries the day, whether the politicians defeat the civil servants.
Mehdi?
Yeah, I agree with Ian. I sound like Gordon Brown in the debates. I agree with Ian. The Tory party, and you may have seen an article in the Jewish Chronicle this week, the Jewish Chronicle this week, which the domestic British newspaper of the British Jewish community, has published a piece today pointing out how many prominent Israeli lobby groups and British Jewish leaders have welcomed the Cameron-Hague administration. I think they will be much more pro-Israeli in the Middle East and much more pro-American. The Labour government had been shifting away from that Blairite, Atlanticist, hawkish position in the Middle East, and I fear we may go back to it, which is why it is interesting to see what happens with Liberal Democrat junior positions. Will there be Lib Dems in those departments, in the MOD, in the Foreign Office, to exercise some kind of restraint if Mr Cameron and Mr Hague decide to go all hawkish on us?
Robin Shepherd, I can see you want to come in.
Yes, I mean, I think that, look, obviously it's wait and see. I mean, how politicians behave in opposition and what they say in opposition is often different to how they talk and how they behave in government. But to take William Hague as an example, I mean, you know, he's been sort of all over the shop on Israel-Palestine and on Israel. He was in the 2006 Lebanon war. He was critical, sharply critical of the Israelis, describing their actions as disproportionate. He was saying that the whole enterprise was a bad idea. He felt that they hadn't acquitted themselves in accordance with their own principles and so on and so forth. On Cast Lead, on the other hand, the operation in Gaza, he said quite openly that he didn't condemn the Israelis because he understood that they were under fierce attack from rockets. So, you know, whatever you stand on the Israel-Palestine conflict, wherever your sympathies are, I think when you look at William Hague, you can take pretty much whichever perspective you want. You'll find your quotations where he's been very critical of Israel at important moments, and also quotations where he's tended to be supportive.
Okay, listen, I just want to bring this. I just want to bring this in. Sorry, I just want to bring this full circle back to just take it away from this issue of foreign policy. We're just running out of time now, because we've still got this odd business of a vote in one constituency to take place on May the 27th, where a candidate died, of course. Partners in government will now fight out a seat and argue against each other. It will be a full-on fight, they say. The opposition, Labour Party, are going to make hay of this, aren't they?
Well, they may try to, but this is not a typical by-election. It's come about because one of the candidates died during the general election campaign, and normally this happened in the last election too, in a seat in South Staffordshire, and they're normally quite sedate campaigns. None of the parties, I think, is going to put a full effort into this, although the coalition might change that. But I mean, they are still distinct parties, and of course they're going to fight their corner. In council elections all over the country over the next 4 or 5 years, you will find Liberal Democrats fighting Conservatives in exactly the same way that they did before, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, Mehdi, just very briefly, doesn't the fact this issue of fixed-term Parliament of 5 years, isn't that the fundamental underpinning of their agreement, if you like?
I think it is the underpinning of the agreement. I think we have to look at the detail. There's some confusion over the 55% vote that they're bringing in on votes of disillusion. Does that also apply to votes of confidence? It's not clear to me whether that is the case or not, and whether you'll need more than 55% of the Parliament to bring about dissolution and a new election. Just on the point of the election that's coming up later this month, I mean, it's fascinating that the Liberal Democrat candidate there is saying that Labour voters should vote for him to stop the Tory candidate. I mean, the Lib Dems are mad if they think they're going to get any more tactical votes from the Labour Party. There are thousands upon thousands of Labour voters who have helped Lib Dem MPs get elected across the country last week, who will not be doing so at the next election. I fear the Lib Dems will be crushed between the two main parties at the next election, and will regret this coalition decision.
Who knows what twists and turns lie ahead, gentlemen. We've run out of time. We'll have to see how this extraordinary new arrangement pans out. Ian Dale, Mehdi Hasan and Robin Shepherd, thanks very much indeed for your contributions to this very interesting discussion. And thanks for watching this edition of Inside Stories. Do send us any thoughts or points of view to insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye.